Earlier this year, we witnessed Russia invade Ukraine under the guise of special military operations. South Africa's position on the incident sparked great debate around its foreign policy objectives. Some have argued that this demonstrates a misalignment, and others suggest it has been misunderstood. I am Ubusisi Posiobi, researcher at GGA, and here to discuss the matter in more detail is my colleague Richard Jurgens, editor of GGA's academic journal, the Africa Governance Papers. Can you please tell us what actually sparked the Russia-Ukraine war?
The first thing was that in 2014 there was an uprising against the government because Ukraine was moving more in the direction of Europe. And Russia, Vladimir Putin in particular, perceived that as a threat. The second was that Russia annexed Crimea, which had been part of Russia, and that caused some international outrage, and tensions have risen from there.
And of course there's been intervention from the international community. What have their responses been looking like?
There were a number of votes at the UN, 3 resolutions in particular, condemning Russia's aggression in Ukraine. And the first one was about Russia's invasion, the second one was aimed at protecting civilians, and the third one was about possibly suspending Russia from the Human Rights Council at the UN. Just under half of African countries in particular abstained or voted against the resolutions. One of them, of course, as we know, was South Africa.
What are some of the guiding principles underpinning South Africa's foreign policy?
The post-apartheid government has set about establishing South Africa as a premier state in Africa. I put it that way, not the premier state. Then President Thabo Mbeki worked out a very comprehensive deal with Nigeria through NEPAD, which essentially was an agreement between the 2 biggest countries on the continent not to try and dominate the continent politically. And it worked very well for a while. It was a very sophisticated agreement, but that was essentially undone about the time that then President Zuma took power, when our policy was very different. Then another thread which the post-apartheid government has introduced, which has been very important, is the aim of representing a human rights-based approach to international relations, focusing particularly on the global south. That's been expressed by the government and is a major element of its strategic documents and has been for years.
Have we seen these guiding principles actually being implemented, and what do they look like?
There's a pattern of voting, of abstaining very often from resolutions involving human rights issues. And so for instance, I think it's in 2016, if I'm not mistaken, we abstained from a vote which condemned essentially what was essentially recognized as a genocide against the Rohingya people in Myanmar. And given our human rights background and our insistence on human rights, that was an example of a vote that was pretty incomprehensible to most people. And there's been a pattern of voting like that over time. Another one was our abstention from a resolution of the UN Security Council that Zimbabwe be investigated for its violence against citizens. And in that case, our abstention was based on the argument that there was a procedural error, that issue shouldn't be considered by the Security Council, it should be considered by the Human Rights Council. So very often you see a pattern in these votes of the use of procedural arguments, which seem in the end to have the outcome of supporting authoritarian governments, even if their direct purpose is apparently not that.
In the Russia-Ukraine case, what could have been South Africa's influence to abstain from voting?
Certainly from the first resolution in early March, was that it reframed the issue of the violence in Ukraine as a general humanitarian issue. And secondly, it called for the conflict, which it framed as a kind of general thing, and it framed as a kind of mutual conflict between 2 countries at war, should be settled by conciliation and negotiation, which was advanced as one of South Africa's principles.
Why has South Africa's decision been viewed as controversial?
You know, overthrowing apartheid was a long struggle, and it required the support. It required the support of many countries around the world and the recognition of the basic underlying humanitarian issue that was involved in South Africa. So that's our deep background. We relied on many countries around the world, not necessarily the states, the governments, but certainly the people in our struggle against apartheid. Secondly, there's our stated principle of basing our foreign policy broadly on human rights, which seems to have been contradicted by not only the stance in Ukraine, but by many of the other abstentions and votes, particularly at the UN.
The question on everyone's mind is South Africa actually actively supporting Russia?
I think it's important to be clear that an abstention at the UN, at whatever council or body you're talking about, counts essentially as a statement of non-alignment, if not neutrality. So that's the technical understanding of abstention, and that's pretty much the understanding that the government has given of its stance on Ukraine. Members of the government have given some supplementary arguments to the decision, which include historic ties with Russia, our economic ties with Russia and BRICS, and that kind of thing. But you could ask whether those ties, certainly with Russia, which has an economy the size of Spain, and with which we have very small economic relations, really counts as a strong argument for indirectly supporting it.
And then, Richard, finally, in terms of SA's foreign policy, how would you feel should be taken forward in its development and implementation?
We must recognize that any decision in international relations involves a complex mix of factors. There's relations between countries, there's domestic issues, there's legal issues, and many others. So any decision is a very complex matter. What appears to have happened is that there's been an emphasis on the political behind-the-scenes reality that the government has felt to be important, and the human rights aspect has not been foregrounded enough. And that is the basis of our whole Constitution. The principles and values of the Constitution are conveyed in the preamble and in the Bill of Rights, and in fact they oblige the government to conduct itself in accordance with our principles and values. And I think in many instances here we just haven't done so.
Richard, thank you very much for providing your insights and analysis. This remains a very complex international relations issue that requires South Africa's foreign policy decisions to be coherently articulated to avoid any confusion or misunderstandings. For more in-depth discussions on policy matters in Africa, please join us again. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel.